Hi, my name is Shcherbakova, and I'm a co-developer of the Baseworks method, and I will be your host for this transmission reflection today. The Baseworks method is an approach to movement and physical practice that has a profound effect on perception and the quality of day-to-day and moment-to-moment experiences. And the Baseworks transmissions look at both concrete and abstract realizations that come up as a result of commitment to any type of practice or pursuit to achieve life goals. And our goal here is to come up with common vocabulary to better describe these experiences and outcomes. And transmission reflections is a format that allows us to reflect on what was discussed during the transmission conversations, digest it, and perhaps even come up with some new perspective on what has unfolded during the talk. This is a companion reflection transmission for the conversation that Patrick Quantico had with Ryan Hurst, one of the three founders of the GMB Fitness. It would make the most sense to first watch or listen to that episode, and you can find the link to that episode in the show notes. So in this transmission, we heard the story of Ryan, who started with gymnastics and then spent more than half of his life doing martial arts in Japan. And now, as he himself puts it, if somebody randomly asked him what he's doing, he would describe himself as a physical education teacher whose goal is helping people to find physical autonomy so that they could do more of the things they enjoy. So in this reflection, I'd like to review how Ryan describes what he personally gained from his extensive training, how he trained himself, then look at his approach to movement education against his background. And of course, we're going to look at the language and the concepts that he uses. Ryan says that what he loved most about gymnastics was the freedom of expressing his body in different ways. Then, after a knee injury, when the door to competitive gymnastics has closed for him, he discovered Japanese martial arts, started learning Japanese language, and eventually ended up in Japan, where he spent more than 25 years and mastered several martial arts disciplines, including Kendo, Judo, Shorinji Kempo, and currently he's also training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And while he talks about all these different experiences in martial arts, he just keeps saying that although he was often injured and people kicked his ass many times and wiped the floor with him, he repeats over and over again that it was great and he just loved it. So what he chooses to highlight as the most valuable things he gained from decades of dedicated practice is essentially the joy and the freedom of movement. And I guess this aligns pretty well with the core idea in GMB Fitness that it's about developing physical autonomy, the freedom of movement for the sake of doing more of the things that you love and enjoy. As you might know, I'm a big proponent of drawing parallels between language and physical movement, so it was very interesting to hear how Ryan was essentially doing the same, drawing the parallels between learning language and martial arts training. Ryan's Japanese teacher back in the States had told him once that the only way to learn anything is to actually experience it, and this is why you have to go and make mistakes. So at some point, Ryan told himself, the only way I'm going to be able to improve my Japanese and get really good at martial arts is if I just get rid of who I was and just basically become a new person. And I think it's pretty cool because how many people do you know who actually approach their training like that? So Ryan adopted this completely immersive approach to study the Japanese language and martial arts. First of all, I guess it really helped that he was living in a rural area in the mountains of Niigata, far away off a big city, so he kind of didn't have many distractions. But what he did is that he moved in with his martial arts teacher, which is still a fairly widespread practice in Japan, in various forms of martial arts and also some traditional arts where you essentially become an apprentice and sometimes you live at the dojo and sometimes directly at your teacher's house. So it's very interesting how Ryan describes his training in this period, and I'm first going to quote him on language learning. So this is what he says. It's with any learning. You first find a person that you want to mimic, and you use them as a template. You train their mannerisms, their speech patterns, intonation. You monitor what they do and then practice and practice and practice to the point where those things become natural. And then, using this well-learned internalized material, you find other patterns that fit more closely to your character. So I would say it's definitely true for language. And one of the reasons why so many people find it difficult to learn new languages is because they just keep translating in their head from their native language word to word, instead of allowing the new language to take a root and kind of develop it as a skill. And I guess it's also similar to the fake it or make it idea, or when you create a narrative for yourself as a kind of a technology for behavioral change, as for example Satoko has written in one of her articles. So anyway, back to Ryan. Because he was living with his teacher, training several times a day, of course his martial arts practice was very immersive, and he uses the same language to describe his martial arts training. He says, I was constantly in a state of how is that person doing it. And I find it's actually a very important point, paying attention not to what the person is doing, like the overall general idea of the action, but to how they are doing it, that is, the details. In the first case, you may end up doing what you already know how to do, and you can get easily stuck in your progress, whereas the second approach is much more effective in acquiring new skills, especially for those skills where you don't fully understand why you're doing this movement in this way from the start, or what are the important features of the movement. So by mimicking another person as closely as you can, you eventually discover the purpose and intention behind the movement. And of course, in the context of martial arts, and as it was mentioned many times throughout this transmission, this is the shu of shuhari, following what your teacher does without questioning. And there were two very interesting turns in how Ryan was talking about this. The first one is that he mentions that he thinks that in the long run, it probably wasn't mentally the healthiest thing to do. And I quote, it mentally kind of fucked him up down the road, end of quote. And I would be so interested to know more details about that, but unfortunately Ryan only briefly mentions this in this transmission. And so the second thing that he is talking about this around this point is that he had a lot of respect for his teacher, obviously, but then he clearly remembered the day when he realized he's just a person. And then Ryan says, I remember that was a big change for me, because that allowed me to finally realize, okay, use him as a template, do what he's doing, but then understand that I eventually need to find my own style. And he, the teacher, would be talking about this too all the time. So Ryan says that living with his Kendo teacher obviously allowed him to get the techniques faster, but also helped him to see the teacher as a person rather than a god. And he mentions that the word sensei in Japanese is spelled as saki ni umareta, the one who was born before you. So you listen to the teacher not because they're a god, but simply because they have more experience. Of course, across traditional Japanese arts, shuhari has much deeper philosophical meaning than just learn the basics first and then you can improvise. And among these many things is that it helps to maintain the traditional form of the art, and the teacher actually has to pass the same techniques to the next generation, therefore becoming a vehicle or a vessel for the art form, transcending their egos. So what I heard in this transmission is that this idea that the teacher is just a person and the student eventually has to find their own character really resonates with Ryan's position in GMB, where he says that he doesn't want to be seen as a guru. And he says that his role as an educator is to, and I quote, leak out the information in a way that's going to be what we feel good for that person at that time, so they're not overwhelmed and that they can focus on that thing and actually get good at it. Ryan describes the purpose of GMB Fitness like this. It's about how can we help others to do the things that they want to be able to do in their life. It's not about doing more exercise. It's about having the physical autonomy to know exactly where you are in your body so that you can do more of the things you love. And according to Ryan, over the years, the method has evolved together with the concepts used to describe it, which became much more refined. And Ryan says that if they used the method as it is today, back when they started, the community probably would not have understood it. And I can really resonate with this realization because we definitely see the same trend with Baseworks. So talking about the GMB method, Ryan mentions 3 conceptual frameworks that I want to talk about that I actually feel reflect what's important in learning movement skills. So firstly, Ryan talks about strength, flexibility, and control as the key components of physical autonomy that can be trained through practice. Strength and flexibility, I guess, are the most conventional categories of gains used in fitness, so no surprise here. But Ryan stresses out that control is the aspect that many places don't talk about. And I guess I cannot really comment on how many places don't talk about motor control because for us it's such an important general keyword. But I definitely like the simplicity and the beauty of this 3-word formula. And as Ryan puts it, compared to typical exercise, GMB is not about how many reps you need to build muscle, but it's about developing skills. So when training a particular movement, you are not trying to do as many repetitions as possible, but rather you're trying to do the movement with as much awareness as possible so that you can better understand the movement that you train. So control can be understood as skill, or as this quality of agility and intentionality in movement that can be seen in professional athletes. The GMB control is more or less synonymous with motor control. In Baseworks, we would definitely put control into our top 4 of trainable qualities, but we always pair it with sense because motor control can be better understood as sensory motor control, and the sensory component is absolutely crucial. And I'm just going to jump to the next framework right now, but I'm going to come back to this connection between sensory and motor at the end of this reflection. So in addition to the strength, flexibility, control framework, they also have the AAA framework, that is assess, address, and apply. You assess where you are at, what's holding you back. Then you address what you need. So for example, if you're lacking in shoulder strength or range of motion, you will be targeting those specific prerequisites that you are lacking. And then you apply what you've learned to other things you want to do. So within this framework, the actual practice happens at the address stage, informed by the assess. And a practice session has 5 types of sections, which form another easy to remember framework of the 5 Ps, which is prep, practice, play, push, and ponder. And I think it's a great framework, both conceptually and methodologically. And I'm going to review it first, and then I'm going to give a couple of comments. Prep is something like a smart and targeted warm-up section. So for example, if you are going to be practicing squats, you will not be warming up every joint in your body, but rather you will focus on hip mobility. Then practice is the main part of the session where you train a certain skill, and you're not chasing after the number of reps, but after the quality and understanding of the movement. Then play is where you experiment with well-learned movements, never with new movements. And Ryan says that this play aspect is something that people don't talk about very much, but it's a very important step where you can explore, and also this is where the aha moments tend to happen. And he gives an example of what play could look like, as in, for example, going out of alignment a little bit to see what happens when you do that.
So if you've resonated so far with any of the topics discussed, please consider sharing it with others and clicking the like button. This is really going to help more people find it and support all the efforts that go into this production. Your being here to check out this episode today is a massive contribution toward the sharing of ideas that unfold in these talks, and thank you very much for your support. And subscribe to get real-time notifications about all upcoming episodes.
And then the practice to play transition was again correlated with the shu to ha transition in shuhari. And then there's push, and Ryan says that this is what most people typically do in their workouts, but in a GMB session, you push only in the movements which you already know well. And there is so much movement science wisdom in this approach that I just wish more people would think like that. And also you're supposed to increase the intensity only to the point where you can still keep good form. So then the session finishes with ponder, and at this stage you reflect back on the entire session, analyzing how it went. So Ryan also says that the 5P framework is kind of modeled after how the 3 GMB fitness founders approach their own martial arts practices. And here I quote, "When we practice, we start off and we prepare our body, and then there is a particular technique that we want to practice. Then we get with our partner and we try out some variations. Then we spar, that is the push section of it, and at the very end we sit and we reflect. So framing is obviously very important, and these GMB frameworks manage to focus on very important aspects of physical education that receive little attention in conventional fitness. If you've listened to this transmission episode, you may have noticed how Ryan puts emphasis on whether a movement is already well learned or not to determine whether it's going to be used for practice or for push or play. Different parts of the same movement are handled by different parts of the brain, and also different stages of movement skill acquisition are handled by different and often competing systems. So the breakdown of the practice into practice, play, and push actually respects what the nervous system has to do in order to produce a new skill. So I think it's a really cool framework. As Patrick mentions in the transmission, the trajectories in GMB Fitness and Baseworks are quite similar. I'd like to try and map the similarities between the approaches and the vocabulary, and also highlight some differences. The prep, practice, play, push, and ponder framework in Baseworks would be spread out evenly across the entire practice session, or you could maybe say distributed, because a lot of things are distributed in Baseworks. So we will be doing this prep, play, push, and ponder all throughout the practice, although which aspect comes at the forefront at which point will depend on the type of movement, on the level of skill, on the condition of the day, and many other factors. And also the ability to decide when to prep, when to play, when to push, when to ponder is also something that we will be training in the Baseworks practice. So for prep, we don't do any specific warm-up sequences of movements, whether targeted or not. But if a particular movement requires some mobility work or considerations to avoid injury, we will just have this aspect dialed in into how we perform the movement. Then for play, our micro movements are all about exploration, and play also exists, I would say, at the edge of intensity modification, which is one of the principles in the Baseworks method, which can be maybe roughly correlated with the auto-regulation concept in GMB language. Then the push aspect in Baseworks is very similar to the GMB idea that the upper limit of the intensity you can use is where you can still keep the good form. And in fact, a lot of training in Baseworks practice for many people is about unlearning the push attitude. Then ponder again exists as an attitude from start to finish. It's about noticing how different aspects of different movements are interconnected with each other and with various variables of your condition and so on. And we actually had several people explicitly telling us that Baseworks for them is this kind of metaphorical place that connects the dots. So while in Baseworks, these 5 types of learning activities are kind of embedded into the mesh of the practice and maybe takes time to get your head around it, in GMB, because they're clearly separated into stages, it's super easy for people to understand them and start benefiting from these concepts from day one, which I really think is great. Then for the AAA framework, the assess, address, apply, the address and assess aspects in Baseworks practice would work in a cycle within each practice session and even sometimes within the same movement, whereas the apply aspect will go outside of the practice and maybe real life, and then it will feed back into Baseworks practice as a source of new learning perspectives. So in this way, Baseworks approach is much more cyclical, and we don't actually view skill development as a linear process, and we constantly work towards revisiting and rediscovering more and more intricate aspects of the existing skills. And another related and very important difference in our approaches is how we think about whole body movements. So the GMB idea is that the best way towards physical autonomy is working with complex physical skills rather than isolating muscle groups in traditional exercises. And I guess we share the view on the traditional gym workouts in this aspect, but where GMB says, let's focus on building complex whole body skills, in Baseworks we say, well, but everything we do actually already is complex whole body skills. So what we're trying to do in Baseworks is actually to break down these complex whole body skills into more fundamental skill building blocks. Also, when talking about skills, GMB follows the idea of motor skills used in sports, where your final goal is to develop more complex skills so that you can score more points, or in the case of GMB, you get more physical autonomy. So a skill has this very positive connotation, and it is something that we can aspire to develop. Whereas in Baseworks, we use the word skill in a much more kind of general and neutral way, referring to any well-learned action that can be exercised automatically and most of the time with very little awareness of how exactly it is performed. One of our core ideas is that most people are largely not aware what exactly their bodies are doing when performing complex movements. By becoming more aware of various aspects of complex movements and learning to control these aspects, developing a fundamental movement vocabulary, people tend to spontaneously discover how to improve movements that are not even part of Baseworks curriculum. So in this way, the GMB approach is much more kind of straightforward, where you have a physical goal, and then the program strategically guides you towards that goal in a way that is aligned with your current abilities and conditions. So it is much more targeted and personalized than many fitness programs, which is, I think it's really, really great. But in Baseworks, we have a much more kind of open-ended approach, where our program guides you towards better understanding and controlling your body so that you can discover new experiences and goals. And of course, we can work with someone in a more closed way, focusing on addressing their needs and concerns and maybe requests. But from my own perspective, I can say that the outcomes of the Baseworks training that I value the most, they lie completely outside of what I could imagine when I started the training. And also, I don't even need to move to experience them. There's one more observation I'd like to make before I wrap up. It took Ryan about 1 year to get the black belt in Kendo. And when he describes his transition from gymnastics to martial arts, he says that it was actually relatively easy because from gymnastics he already had, and he puts it like this, good spatial awareness, the ability to use the body in different ways, and being comfortable with it. And I find it interesting that when he's talking about his own experience and he chooses to highlight 3 things, they are different shades of awareness and control and not strength, flexibility, and control. Although all the 3 GMB founders have extensive background in martial arts, GMB is not martial arts. But what they bring from martial arts is this certain attitude towards the practice, and also this idea that movement should have intentionality and meaningful context. And actually, Ryan had written a very entertaining and witty article about mindfulness, where he says that movement for the sake of movement without a meaningful context that matches your life can lead to random, inauthentic displays of quote-unquote mindfulness. If it's not meaningful with intent, it's meaningless and empty. End of quote. So if you haven't read this article, I really recommend to check it out. It's really funny. Martial arts training is what Ryan says he absolutely loved. But when it comes to GMB fitness, he says, and again I quote, "It's not about me, it's about you." And I feel a lot of compassion and this very supportive attitude towards the GMB community. And it's also amazing how the community responds. And if you just take a look at their Instagram, you will know what I mean. And then Ryan himself in this transmission said that it's all about the community. So if you're listening to this and you are not familiar with GMB fitness, I really recommend you check it out because it's a great thought through method that goes beyond traditional fitness categories and narratives, and also it's a great community. And finally, on the last note, with all those experiences in Niigata, the complete immersion in Japanese culture, the reverence towards the culture, and this proactive desire to understand it and showing up and actually putting effort into it. Like hearing that all, I'm really sensing that it must have been a very, very deep experience, and probably more than just simply physical autonomy in the sense of being strong and flexible and skilled in movement. Obviously, there was not enough time to talk about everything, but I personally would have liked to hear a little bit more about the concrete gains and realizations from Ryan's personal experience, because these verbal descriptions are really important to expand the pool of information about concrete experiences potentially attainable through various types of practices. And also going deeper into personal introspective realizations is also something that Patrick is really passionate about in Baseworks. So no doubt he'll go deep into these things when Ryan comes on again. And I'd like to finish off with another inspirational quote from this transmission with Ryan, where he said, "I don't believe in luck. I believe that things happen if you actually not just search, but purposely put yourself in a position to be open to those opportunities." So I wish all the listeners and viewers to be able to take such a proactive approach in whatever it is they want to achieve. If anything that you heard today resonated with you, please consider liking or sharing or subscribing to our channel, or even leaving us a 5-star review. Your contribution helps us to reach more people with the content that we're sharing. And if you have any ideas or comments that you would like to share with me or us, please send them to ideas@baseworks.com. To find out more about Ryan or GMB Fitness, you can check out their website at gmb.io or their Instagram at gmbfitness, one word. To benefit from exclusive content delivered right into your inbox, consider signing up for our newsletter from the footer on any page of our website. And to know more about Baseworks specifically or everything that we're doing, visit our website at baseworks.com.